Of all the Stoic philosophers, Seneca is the hardest one to accuse of simply theorizing about wealth from a comfortable distance, because he had an enormous amount of it. Through a combination of imperial favour, shrewd investment, and his position advising the Emperor Nero, Seneca became one of the richest private citizens in the entire Roman Empire, with estates, villas, and a fortune that dwarfed almost everyone around him. Some ancient sources estimated his personal fortune at roughly 300 million sesterces, a genuinely staggering sum by the standards of the time, enough to fund armies or build entire towns. If any Stoic had genuine first-hand authority to speak about what wealth actually does and doesn't provide, it was Seneca. And his conclusion, expressed across his letters and essays, was surprisingly consistent. Wealth itself is not evil, and poverty isn't automatically virtuous either. The Stoics generally classified money as what they called a preferred indifferent, something that isn't inherently good or bad in a moral sense, but that most people would reasonably prefer to have rather than not have, given a straightforward choice. Seneca wasn't arguing that people should reject comfort or give away everything they owned. His argument was more specific and in some ways more uncomfortable to actually accept. Wealth doesn't deliver what people expect it to deliver, and chasing it as a solution to deeper problems almost always ends in disappointment. He observed this pattern directly among the wealthy Romans he spent his life surrounded by. Money solved certain practical problems easily enough: hunger, exposure, immediate physical discomfort. But it did almost nothing to solve the problems people actually seemed most anxious about once their basic needs were met: anxiety, dissatisfaction, fear of loss, comparison with others, a nagging sense that something was still missing. If anything, Seneca suggested, wealth often made some of these problems worse rather than better. A person with nothing has little to lose, and in a strange way, less to fear losing. A person with enormous wealth has an enormous amount to protect, and Seneca noted that the wealthiest people he knew were often more anxious about their fortunes than genuinely secure in them. He was especially critical of the way wealth tends to reset a person's expectations rather than satisfy them. Someone struggling to make ends meet imagines that a certain amount of money would finally bring them peace and contentment. But once that amount is reached, the goalpost rarely stays still. New comforts become the new baseline, and the mind adjusts, wanting more almost immediately, the same way it wanted more before. Seneca described this as a kind of trap, not because wealth itself is dangerous, but because the pursuit of it, treated as an end goal rather than a tool, tends to become endless. There's always a slightly richer, more comfortable version of life, just visible on the horizon, no matter how much you've already accumulated. There's a specific comparison Seneca returned to more than once. He noted that wealthy Romans were often more troubled by small financial losses, a bad investment, an unexpected expense, than poorer citizens were troubled by genuine hardship, simply because the wealthy had built their entire sense of security around a number that could always, in principle, go down. The poor citizen, having never rested his peace of mind on a number in the first place, had less available to lose in that particular way. It's not that Seneca thought poverty was preferable. It's that he noticed wealth introduces its own specific, avoidable form of anxiety that people rarely account for when they imagine what having more money would actually feel like. His practical advice wasn't to reject money entirely, which would have been a strange position for a man who kept most of his own fortune throughout his life. Instead, he recommended something closer to detachment, using wealth when you have it, enjoying the genuine comforts it can provide, but not building your sense of security or identity around it, since it can be lost through circumstances entirely outside your control. He reportedly practiced periods of deliberate simplicity himself, eating plain food and living without luxury for stretches of time, specifically so that poverty, if it ever arrived through misfortune, wouldn't feel like an unbearable shock. If you already know you can live simply and be fine, the fear of losing your wealth loses much of its grip on you. This practice deserves a little more explanation, because it's a genuinely usable technique rather than just an interesting historical detail. Seneca would deliberately set aside a few days at a time to eat the coarsest food available, wear the roughest clothing he owned, and sleep in the least comfortable conditions he could arrange. Not as punishment, but as a kind of rehearsal. The goal was to test, directly and first-hand, whether the things he feared losing were actually as unbearable to live without as his imagination suggested. Almost every time he reported, the answer turned out to be no. Plain food was still food, rough clothing still kept him warm, and the fear had been considerably worse than the reality it was attached to. There's an obvious tension in a man this wealthy giving this particular advice, and Seneca knew it. His critics certainly pointed it out during his own lifetime, accusing him of hypocrisy for preaching simplicity while living in genuine luxury. His response, in essence, was that the philosophy was never about refusing wealth. It was about not needing it, about holding it loosely enough that if it disappeared tomorrow through political disfavour, confiscation, or plain misfortune, the person holding it would still be fundamentally fine, because their sense of self was never actually built on top of it in the first place. That tension became more than theoretical toward the end of his own life. Seneca eventually fell out of favour with Nero and was ordered to take his own life. And by most historical accounts, he met that final moment with the same composure his writing had spent decades describing, reportedly far more concerned with comforting the people around him than with the fortune he was about to leave behind entirely. Whatever you make of the earlier accusations of hypocrisy, it's difficult to argue he didn't eventually get the chance to prove whether his philosophy actually held up when everything material was finally completely taken from him. It's worth sitting with how rare that actually is. Plenty of people write convincingly about not fearing loss, while their own circumstances remain comfortable and untested. Very few end up in a position where the theory and the reality collide directly, with nothing left to fall back on and no more time to revise the argument. Seneca's fortune, his estates, his decades of influence at the highest level of Roman politics, all of it evaporated in his final hours, and the account that survives describes a man who, whatever his earlier contradictions, spent those hours exactly the way his own writing had always claimed a person should: steady, present, and more concerned with the people around him than with everything he was about to lose. There's a modern version of Seneca's core warning worth spelling out directly, because the specific mechanism he described maps almost exactly onto something contemporary psychology now has its own name for: hedonic adaptation, the tendency for improvements in circumstances to quickly become the new normal, resetting the baseline for what feels satisfying. A raise that once seemed like it would solve everything gets absorbed within months into a slightly more expensive lifestyle, and the underlying feeling of not quite enough returns right on schedule, just at a higher number than before. Seneca didn't have the vocabulary of modern psychology, but he'd clearly watched this exact pattern play out repeatedly among wealthy Romans, which is why his warning reads less like moral judgment and more like a practical observation about how the mind actually works once a goalpost gets reached. The deliberate simplicity practice he describes is worth trying in some small form, even without going anywhere near the extremes he reportedly practiced. A single day, once in a while, spent deliberately choosing the plainer option, the simpler meal, the older clothes, skipping a convenience you'd normally reach for without thinking, isn't about punishing yourself or performing austerity for its own sake. It's a direct physical test of exactly the fear Seneca was trying to diffuse in his readers. The quiet assumption that losing your current comforts would be genuinely unbearable. Most people who actually try it find, the same way Seneca reported finding, that the discomfort is real, but far smaller than the anticipation of it, which is precisely the gap his entire argument about wealth was built to expose. That's the final episode in this first batch. If any of these 10 ideas actually changed how you're thinking about something in your own life, that's really the entire point of this channel. Subscribe, because there's a lot more of this philosophy still to come.